Hello and welcome! Today, we are diving deep into one of World War II's most brutal and, honestly, iconic battles. It's a fight that, for most of us, is defined by a single, powerful photograph.
But for the men who were actually there, on the ground, the reality of the Battle of Iwo Jima was, well, something else entirely. A correspondent for Time Life, Robert Sherrod, put it pretty bluntly. He just called it a nightmare in hell.
So to really get why he'd say that, let's start with a number. 28,698. Think about that for a second. That's the total number of American casualties. We're talking killed, wounded, or missing. All to capture this tiny volcanic island that was only 8 square miles. Just incredible.
Okay, so let's get right into it. To see how this all kicked off, we're going to go straight to the landing, the morning of February 19th, 1945.
So, when the first waves of U.S. Marines hit the beaches, you'd expect a hail of bullets, right? But no, not at first. Instead, they were met with this almost impossible obstacle. 15-foot-high slopes of soft, black volcanic ash. You couldn't run, you couldn't even dig a foxhole for cover. It was like trying to fight on quicksand. And for over an hour, the Japanese defenders just watched. They held their fire with this incredible, almost eerie discipline. They just waited, luring thousands of men and all their equipment onto these crowded beaches, and then they sprung the trap. A devastating barrage of machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire just erupted from perfectly hidden positions. The nightmare had officially begun.
The sheer ferocity of it all, the coordination of the Japanese defense, it just baffled the American commanders. So to really understand why, we need to rewind a bit and look at what the Marines were truly up against.
So, why Iwo Jima? What was so important about this tiny speck of an island? Well, strategically, it was crucial for 2 big reasons. First, it had a Japanese early warning station. This station was tipping off the mainland about incoming B-29 bomber raids. Taking it meant blinding the enemy. And second, it was the perfect spot for a base for American P-51 fighters, which could then escort those bombers all the way to Japan and back.
Now here's where things get interesting. American military intelligence was, well, let's just say dangerously optimistic. They figured the longest naval bombardment of the entire war had basically flattened the island's defenses. They actually predicted victory in under a week. Man, they could not have been more wrong.
See, the Japanese commander, a general named Tadamichi Kuribayashi, he totally threw out the old playbook. He broke with traditional doctrine completely. He told his men no suicidal bonsai charges on the beaches. Instead, he had them dig in for a defense in depth. We're talking a fortress of 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, bunkers, and hidden artillery positions. His plan wasn't to win. It was to make the Americans bleed for every single inch of that volcanic rock.
And this plan, this revolutionary strategy, it turned what was supposed to be a 5-day battle into a horrific 5-week fight of brutal, close-quarters combat. The Marines had a name for it. They grimly called it the meat grinder. It was a place where you didn't measure progress in miles, but in bloody yards, gained by clearing one hidden position after another.
And the pace of the fighting was just grueling. From the landing on February 19th, it took 4 full days of non-stop, intense combat just to isolate and capture one landmark, Mount Suribachi. Every single day was just this slow, terrifying crawl against an enemy you couldn't even see, an enemy who could strike from literally any direction. The island wasn't officially declared secure until March 26th, over a month later.
So, let's talk about the obstacles. The first major one was the island itself. That volcanic ash, it wasn't just tough to walk on. It actually absorbed artillery fragments, which meant the naval bombardments were way less effective. And, like we said, it was impossible for the Marines to dig in for protection from that constant, relentless enemy fire.
And the next huge challenge? Kuribayashi's brilliant and terrifying tunnel system. Just picture this. A Marine unit would fight its way to a Japanese bunker. They'd clear it out with grenades, think the job was done, only to be shot in the back moments later. Why? Because Japanese soldiers had simply moved through a hidden tunnel and reoccupied the very same position. It was maddening.
So, it became pretty clear pretty fast that conventional firearms just weren't cutting it against these fortified positions. The Marines had to adapt on the fly. They started relying heavily on new weapons, things like the M4 Sherman Zippo tanks. These were tanks equipped with incredibly powerful flamethrowers, really the only effective way to clear out the caves and bunkers for good.
Okay, but amidst all this carnage and horror, a single, powerful moment happened on the fourth day of the battle. And this one moment would come to define not just the fight for Iwo Jima, but for a lot of people, the entire American war effort in the Pacific.
You know the one I'm talking about, right? We've all seen it. Joe Rosenthal's Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. But what's fascinating is that the real story behind this iconic image is, well, it's way more complex and in some ways pretty tragic than the photo itself lets on.
So, let's break it down. First off, that famous photo, it's actually of the second flag raised on Suribachi that day. A smaller one had gone up a few hours earlier. Second, and this is just heartbreaking, 3 of the 6 men you see in that photo were killed in action on Iwo Jima just days later. And finally, get this, the Marine Corps has had to officially correct the identities of the men in the photo 3 separate times over the years. It's a complicated history.
And that's the thing. While that photograph became this incredibly powerful symbol of victory and resilience back home, for the men still fighting and dying on Iwo Jima, the flag going up just meant one hill had been taken. The battle, the meat grinder, was far, far from over.
So after 36 brutal, soul-crushing days, the island was finally secured. But the staggering cost, the sheer number of lives lost, it immediately raised a really difficult and controversial question. A question that, honestly, is still debated to this day.
And that question is, was it worth it? Because when you look at the brutal math of the battle, it's just staggering. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed. Over 19,000 were wounded. In fact, Iwo Jima stands as the only battle in the entire history of the Marine Corps where American casualties were actually higher than the enemy's.
So the debate goes like this. The main justification for the invasion, right, was that the island's airfields would save the lives of B-29 bomber crews by giving them an emergency landing strip. And it's true, over 2,200 B-29s did land on Iwo Jima. But the critics fire back that most of those landings were just for routine refueling, not real emergencies. And those fighter escorts the island was supposed to host? Turns out they were largely unnecessary.
And this wasn't just something people started arguing about after the war with the benefit of hindsight. No, this debate was raging even at the time. The former chief of naval operations, William Pratt, was on record questioning the immense cost in lives for an island he felt offered pretty limited strategic value. Which really leaves us with a final, very difficult thought. There is no question that the Battle of Iwo Jima is an undeniable symbol of American heroism and incredible sacrifice. But when you know the full story, it forces us to ask some tough questions. How should we remember victory? And maybe more importantly, how do we even begin to measure the true devastating cost of war?